Hi, so this week I'm going to be talking about three different books by the author Russel Freedman. So when I chose my books for this forum, I actually just Googled all the different authors that were given to us on the list, and I tried to find one that I was most interested in some of their work. So I chose Russell Freedman because all of the books that I found that were here at the library in Sioux Falls, the public libraries, all of the books that were available were all like historical context books, which I'm really into history. I think it's super fascinating, so I chose to check those books out, look through them, read them, and talk about them this week. So the first book that I checked out was Children of the Great Depression. This is what it looks like. So this book basically is just a timeline and a history of the Great Depression, and it really focuses on children of the Great Depression. In the very back of the book, Russell Freedman kind of talks about how there has been accounts of children who were born during the Great Depression, grew up during the Great Depression, teenagers, that kind of thing, and how it affected them, but there's only been like a handful of studies, like probably under 5, that people have really done extensive studies on how the Great Depression actually affected children when they were born and when they were growing up during the Great Depression. So what he did was he kind of took stuff from those case studies, and then he also interviewed people from the Great Depression and took like third-person accounts, first-person accounts, that type of thing, to almost make a nonfiction type of book, or it could be called a bibliography or a biography in some sense, although it's multiple people's stories put into one different book. So I just took some notes from this book because it's a pretty long book, so I'm not going to explain about the whole thing. But some of the things that I wrote down was that the pictures in here are from federal photographers during the 1930s across America. So when the Great Depression was going on, there were some photographers that were hired during the 1930s by Roosevelt that were part of the FSA, and what he wanted them to do was travel across America and take pictures across America, different cities, different states, to see how the Great Depression differed and how it was all the same, because he wanted to keep updated on his Americans and see how they were coping with the Great Depression and the stock market crash and all that stuff. So that's where all the pictures come from in this book. It's a really great book because it has really good pictures. They are all black and white, but there's pictures on almost every other page. So this is great for the younger students who would not be able to read this type of selection, but they would be able to see some really great pictures that were taken during this time. And I just wrote a few things that I had found in the reading. So more of half of the nation's children's families could not provide food, shelter, clothing, or medical aid for them, which is very sad. And like I said, there's black and white photos in here. They're almost on every single page or every other page. They're glossy, so they're really nice quality. And then since we're on this page, I just thought it was really interesting, so I'm not sure if you can tell, but basically these are like a typical grocery list, and then over here this is the average annual income, and there's actually a school teacher on here. So the annual income during the Depression for a school teacher was $1,200. So that could really help students put into perspective just how tough times were during that time. So and then this is told through like first person through third person accounts. It also has like a narrator. So there's like an overarching like story being told, which is just the history of the Great Depression, how it got started, what happened to people during the Great Depression, what was going on. But then there's also first person accounts. There's interviews with people that grew up during the Great Depression, like I said, children and teenagers, because that's what this book focuses on. But it also, like I said, just has like a narrator, so it's not like one big story, but it has multiple stories woven in between facts and an overall arching story of the Great Depression. what I thought was really interesting was there was like a whole chapter or section of the book that talked about race differences and how your race really affected what happened to you during the Great Depression. So if you were Black or African American, you were laid off first compared to your white coworkers, because they thought obviously white people needed the money more over African Americans. So they got laid off first. And then it also talks about immigrants and what America did to those immigrants during this time, which is almost like a reoccurring theme because they were being segregated, they were being put in camps, in housing, and we know that's happening now with our government, so that's kind of interesting to see that the pattern is repeating itself. We also have a whole chapter in here about children that grew up too fast, and they were not allowed to go to school because they had to work and help their parents, which I would say doesn't happen as much nowadays because our society is a little bit different, but children still have to drop out of school to care for their family, for their siblings. And I know there's students here in Sioux Falls that have had to do that and can relate. So it's kind of nice that that's in this book as well because they can relate. And the last thing I wanted to mention was there is a photo in here from Aberdeen, South Dakota, which is actually really cool. So I was flipping through looking at all the pictures in here, and there's actually a picture that was taken in Aberdeen, South Dakota of two boys that are watching TV. So that's just really cool. So that is Children of the Great Depression. So the next book that I got is called Because They Marched, and it is about the People's Campaign for Voting Rights that Changed America. So, yeah. So this one also has black and white photos in it. The paper in this one is not glossy. It's just regular paper. So that almost affects the quality of the pictures because they're not as vibrant as they could be, but they're still really, really awesome pictures. So this book also features just black and white pictures as well. This is also kind of like a narrator, third person, first person account. It's kind of like the Children of the Great Depression. It's very much the same. So it kind of gives like a history of African Americans not being able to vote. It also talks a lot about segregation in schools as well. So it kind of starts out like how that, happened or how it got to be in America. And then it also talks about the multiple protests and marches and certain things that went on during that time in America and how things really changed for African Americans and then for white people as well. So like I said, there is first-person accounts in here from like marches and protests, and there's also pictures that go along with those as well. So we get to read a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. in here, which is really great because we know that he was a very influential person during this time in our history. And we get to read about like the Selma marches and all that type of stuff. There's really, really good pictures in here during like the different protests. Like this is a really good one. This kid has "vote" painted on his forehead. So there's a lot of really great pictures from like the actual protests that maybe children have not seen before. So that's really awesome. This book gives like a history of African Americans fighting for their right to vote and also about their equal rights and just like how unfair it was during this time in America and honestly still is for them. And it really just shows how that change progressed over the years. There's a quote by Martin Luther King towards the end of the book that I thought was interesting. He said during that time it was called the season of suffering for African Americans and how they really suffered during that time because they just felt so lost. They felt so undetermined and they couldn't get any headway and make any difference, which we know obviously they did, but at the time it didn't seem like it. And there's a lot of racist violence during this time. And I think this is a great book because although times have changed and it's been a lot of years, we're still experiencing some of these things today in our society, which is so sad to say. But I almost think we're still in a season of suffering and that really needs to change. And I think this is a great book for students to read and to understand like what people actually went through. I know we spend here in Sioux Falls, I know we spend a lot of time talking about stuff like this during like Martin Luther King's birthday every year. But I really think that like we don't go in depth as we should. And I think this is a great book for that. It's heavy because there's a lot of content in here that's probably not appropriate for some students because it is dark and violent and stuff. But I think that the only way to correct the situation would be if students actually know like what happened and like the truth. So this is a really, really great book for that. And then also at the back of the book, there is a timeline. So it goes through like all the very, very important events, like laws being passed and different protests and stuff like that, marches, at the back of the book. So students can go back and recap what they read through the book. So that's that book. And the last book that I wanted to talk about was Vietnam, A History of the War. So this one is a history of the war, obviously. Like I said, it's another history book, nonfiction. It has black and white pictures in it as well, and these pages are glossy, so they are very, very, like dark pictures, very vibrant, because you really get to see the full intensity of them. So this book obviously is a history of the war. It starts out like the first page. I'll just read like the first couple sentences. Yeah, so it starts out with like a protest, and the chapter is titled The Last Man to Die in Vietnam. So America's war in Vietnam was in its 7th year with no end in sight when 2,000 decorated veterans staged a 4-day invasion of Washington, D.C. in April 1971. Wearing their combat medals on tattered military fatigues, they camped overnight on the grassy mall near the Capitol and sang God Bless America at daybreak outside the Supreme Court. Then they marched to the Capitol, some in wheelchairs or on crutches because of their war wounds, and in a defiant act of protest, ripped off the medals they had received for their service in Vietnam and hurled them onto the Capitol steps. Rarely witnessed the United States a mass rebellion of this kind among the nation's returning war veterans. Some Americans were outraged. So I really like how this book started because it really sets up the mood of the book and how students can understand like this is a serious time in America and that a lot of people were very unhappy. So it really kind of gets the students into the book, gets them curious about why things were happening during the Vietnam War, what was going on. So that's really awesome. And then like I mentioned before, there is black and white pictures in this book, and they're almost on every other page as well. So the students get good like balance of text and pictures. The pictures aren't as big in this book because there's not as much page room for that, but they still get that visual aspect. Let's see. So this is also like a narrator, third person type of thing. There is like lots of first person accounts from the Vietnam War. But overall it's told in like third person accounts. But it's really nice to hear that people that actually were in the war and lived during that time, their accounts are in here because then we can just see like how it affected multiple people during this time. And then what's really great in this book, because I know for me, every single like book or show, whatever, that I've seen about the Vietnam War that is produced by like America or Americans, whatever, is very kind of one-sided because we only know like our side of the story most of the time. But in here, there's like a whole chapter, I'm kind of on it right now, but there's like 2 or 3 chapters about Vietnam and what happened to their government to start war with us, basically, or be in a war with us. So that's really interesting because the kids get to learn like what happened on their side, what happened on our side, and then kind of what happened when we finally came together and started war. So this book really shows how America was ripped apart. Like I said, the book starts out with like a protest of the Vietnam War by soldiers that were in the Vietnam War, or veterans. So it really shows just how torn apart people were about this war and how much they disagreed with it. There's a lot of pictures in here that are from like protests and stuff like that, and just how it affected America and literally tore us apart. And I think that's really interesting to note because I think we in school have learned a lot about the Vietnam War, but we just don't know maybe what happened here at home during that time as well. So it's really great that students could be able to learn about that. And then, as I mentioned with the last book, at the very end of this book as well, there is a timeline of events that were mentioned in this book, so that's really nice. So after reading this pretty big book, students can go back and read through a timeline of the very important events that went on. So overall, I really, really liked these books. Like I said, I'm kind of a history buff, a history nerd, so I really like this kind of thing. But this would be great for like books to have in the classroom, if not used for a lesson or a teaching moment, but just to have on a bookshelf. So during like dear time, students can grab it, either look at the pictures or like actually read through the book. So I really like those. For that aspect, I think they're like tougher reads. There are a lot of words on the pages, and some of the like content and also some of the pictures are graphic. It's not like it shows, like especially in the Vietnam one, it's not like it shows like bloody people and like injuries, whatever, that type of thing, but it does show like dead people. There's some naked people in there, stuff like that. So I feel if these books were in a classroom, it would probably have to be like middle school age, like 6th grade on up, maybe even like 7th or 8th grade on up. 6th grade might be a little too young for that as well. But I do think they'd be really, really great in the classroom. I also really like the author. Like I said, I've never really been exposed to him before doing this forum this week, so I'm really excited to learn more about him and to get more books, hopefully for my classroom, that he has written as well. And I would love to use these books in my classroom someday. I would obviously say that all of them are nonfiction, obviously. And then they're all kind of told in like a biography type of thing, because they're all an account of stuff that happened in our history. So I would say that's what the genre would be. But overall, they're really, really great books, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the author and hopefully using his books in my class someday.